April 7, 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Nazi-occupied Poland. 2 men vanished from the most efficient killing machine in human history. And the craziest part? They hid inside a woodpile for 3 days, while 200 dogs searched inches above their heads. And then they walked 130 kilometers to deliver a 40-page report that would stop the death trains. Rudolf Vrba was 19 years old, a Slovak Jew who had spent 2 years counting the dead. On April 7, 1944, he and Alfred Wetzler crawled into a hollowed-out pile of lumber and waited. 72 hours, no food, no water, no movement, while the entire camp hunted for them. But this isn't just a story about escaping a death camp. It's about the 1,750,000 people Vrba had counted walking into the gas chambers. The 437,000 Hungarian Jews scheduled to arrive in 6 weeks, and the 40-page report that would save 200,000 lives. They used Russian tobacco soaked in gasoline to blind the dogs' noses, a trick from Soviet prisoners who had watched dozens of escapes fail. The dogs walked right past them, inches away, and smelled nothing. This is how 2 men escaped from hell itself, not to save themselves, but to tell the world a truth it refused to believe. Who was Rudolf Vrba, and how did a teenage boy from a small Slovak town end up counting the dead inside the largest killing factory in human history? The answer begins with an ordinary life shattered by extraordinary evil. Rudolf Vrba was born Walter Rosenberg on September 11, 1924, in Topolčany, Slovakia. An ordinary boy from an ordinary town. He was 17 when the Nazis came for him in June 1942. His crime was being Jewish. The transport to Auschwitz took 3 days. Cattle cars packed with families. No food, no water, no explanation. When the doors finally opened, Rudolf stepped onto a platform that would become the last ground 1,100,000 people would ever stand on. He was young, he was strong. He was selected for work. The others were not. What happens to the ones who aren't selected? Where do they go when they walk away from the platform? What are those buildings with the tall chimneys that never stop smoking? Rudolf's job was to sort the belongings of the dead: suitcases, wedding rings, children's toys, mountains of stolen property left by people who had walked into the showers believing they would walk out again. Every day he watched the trains arrive. He watched the selection. He watched thousands of people march toward buildings they would never leave. But Rudolf didn't just watch, he counted. He memorized every transport, every date, every number. By 1944, his figure was staggering: 1,750,000 victims, processed through this single facility, and the world had no idea. That was the genius of the system: secrecy. The victims walked willingly because they believed the lie. Resettlement to the east, work camps, new homes. The doors said showers. The chimneys said something else entirely. Rudolf realized something that would change history. If the truth escaped these walls, it would save hundreds of thousands of lives. The Nazis could only kill efficiently because their victims didn't know they were walking to their deaths. If the next targets knew the truth, they would resist, they would hide, they would run. The machine would break down. But how do you escape from a place designed to make escape impossible? How do you break out of a death factory? Auschwitz was not a prison. It was a factory, a conveyor belt designed for a single purpose: to liquidate human beings with maximum efficiency. 4 gas chambers, 4 crematoriums, capacity of 6,000 bodies per day. The trains arrived endlessly, cattle cars packed with families who had been told they were simply being resettled. The elderly, the children, anyone who looked weak, sent to the left, sent to the showers that were not showers. The rest were tattooed with a number, stripped of their names, condemned to slavery until exhaustion, disease, or starvation killed them. The security was absolute: 2 perimeters, an inner fence and an outer fence. During the day, prisoners worked between them. At night, everyone was locked inside the first circle. Electrified fences surrounded everything. Touch the wire and you died instantly. Some prisoners chose this death deliberately, walked into the fence on purpose, a faster end than what awaited them in the gas chambers. Guard towers with machine guns stood at regular intervals. Searchlights swept the compound every few minutes. A warning wire ran inside the perimeter. Cross it and you would be shot without question, without warning. But the most terrifying security measure was invisible. 200 German shepherds, trained manhunting machines. They could track a scent through concrete, through wood, through steel. When a prisoner vanished, these dogs were unleashed. Anyone hiding anywhere in the camp would be found in minutes. The Nazis had a system for escapes. When someone went missing, lockdown began. Roll call until the fugitive's name was known. Then, the hunt. 200 dogs, hundreds of soldiers. The search lasted exactly 72 hours. Why 72? Nazi logic. After 3 days, the fugitive would be too far away. Patrols were needed elsewhere. The war demanded resources. After 3 days, the outer perimeter was withdrawn. Could that 72-hour window be exploited? Could someone survive 3 days of hiding while 200 dogs searched for them? Rudolf saw something no one else had seen, a flaw in the system, a 72-hour window that could be turned into an escape route. What if you didn't run? What if you hid right there, inside the camp itself? Waited until the outer perimeter was withdrawn, then simply walked out. It was madness. It was brilliant. But it meant surviving 3 days motionless in the most heavily guarded killing ground on Earth. Rudolf had heard a rumor. A few weeks earlier, 4 prisoners had tried to escape using a woodpile in the Mexico sector. The Nazis were building an extension there, preparing to receive hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews. The construction site was littered with lumber. The 4 men had hollowed out a crawl space inside a pile of boards. They climbed in. Friends covered them with more lumber. They survived the manhunt, the full 72 hours. But they made a mistake afterward. They were captured and executed. But they proved the essential thing. The hiding place worked. The dogs didn't find them. The guards walked right past for 3 days. Rudolf found that same woodpile. He climbed inside. In the darkness, he saw a message from his predecessors, scratched words in the wood. A final insult directed at the Nazis. A last act of defiance from men who knew they would die, but refused to be broken. The hideout was ready, but one lethal problem remained. 200 German shepherds. How do you fool a dog's nose? The answer came from Soviet prisoners of war. Russians who had been in Auschwitz from the beginning, who had watched dozens of escape attempts fail, who understood the dogs better than the guards did. One of them revealed the secret. A dog follows a trail of microparticles in the air, but there are scents that don't just confuse. They burn out the receptors. They blind the nose completely. The best remedy was makorka, Russian tobacco, soaked in gasoline. For weeks, Rudolf and Alfred gathered the ingredients. Strong tobacco, pinch by pinch, smuggled from work details, hidden in their bunks. They soaked it in fuel, dried it, stored it. By April, they had enough to create an invisible chemical wall around their hiding place. A wall that 200 trained killers would not be able to penetrate. Rudolf didn't plan alone. His partner was Alfred Wetzler, 26 years old, also Slovak, also Jewish, also condemned to die in this place. They had something most prisoners lacked: absolute trust in each other. In Auschwitz, trust was rarer than food. One wrong word to the wrong person meant death. The Nazis rewarded informants with extra bread, extra days of life. But Rudolf and Alfred had studied every failure. Dozens of escape attempts over 2 years. All ended the same way: capture, torture, public execution, bodies left hanging as a warning. They spent months preparing, learning guard schedules, mapping the territory beyond the fences, calculating the distance to the Slovak border, 130 kilometers through occupied Poland. Every detail memorized, every variable accounted for. Almost every variable. There was one element impossible to calculate. When you're lying in darkness, when you hear dogs scratching the board centimeters from your face, when you hear guards debating whether to tear apart your shelter, Will your nerves hold, or will panic betray you in the final second? They also knew the cost. In the event of capture, death. In the event of success, collective punishment. The Nazis would take vengeance on the entire barracks. Death for everyone who had helped them. But the clock was ticking. In 6 weeks, the Nazis would begin deporting Hungarian Jews. 437,000 people scheduled for transport, 12,000 per day. Families who had no idea they were traveling to a slaughterhouse. If Rudolf and Alfred escaped and told the world what was happening, they could save hundreds of thousands of lives. The risk was worth everything. April 7th, 1944, 2 p.m. Rudolf and Alfred made their move. They wore civilian suits, secretly smuggled in by the camp underground, Dutch overcoats, boots. If they made it past the fences, they had to look like ordinary men, not like walking skeletons from a concentration camp. They walked at a steady pace toward the Woodpile in the Mexico sector. Friends, the few who could be trusted with their lives, distracted the guards, risking everything, drawing the eyes of the SS away from 2 men walking toward a pile of lumber. Rudolf slid into the cramped space first. Alfred followed, 2 bodies pressed together in a gap barely wide enough for one. Their friends sealed the entrance with boards, layer by layer. Then they scattered the mixture of tobacco and gasoline across every surface, thick clouds of it, creating the chemical barrier that would decide whether they lived or died. Those friends could have climbed into the gap themselves. They could have tried to escape. Instead, they walled in their comrades and walked back to the barracks, back into the killing ground, back to a place most of them would never leave. They chose to stay, so Rudolf and Alfred could go. We don't know all of their names. Most didn't survive to see liberation. But without them, the escape would have been impossible. Rudolf and Alfred were alone, pressed together in darkness, a space where it was impossible to move, to stretch, to square your shoulders. You couldn't speak, you couldn't breathe deeply, you couldn't shift your weight. Above them, the sounds of Auschwitz, the boots of guards, the barking of dogs. Thousands of prisoners who had no idea what was happening a meter beneath their feet. In a few hours, the sirens would wail, and the 72 hours of hell would begin. 5:30 p.m. Evening roll call. Rudolf and Alfred heard it from inside their wooden grave. Shouted commands, lines of prisoners, the daily ritual of counting the condemned. But today, the numbers wouldn't add up. 5:45 p.m. Nothing yet. Maybe they didn't notice. Maybe there was a counting error. 6 p.m. Silence. This silence was more terrifying than any noise. It meant the guards were recounting, double-checking, making absolutely sure. There was no mistake. 6:12 p.m. The siren. A piercing wail that made the blood of every prisoner run cold. A sound that meant one thing: someone was missing. The chaos began. German commands echoing across the camp. 200 German shepherds unleashed. Rudolf heard them scattering across the territory. The scratching of claws on dry earth, feverish sniffing, getting closer, closer. They froze, not moving, scarcely breathing. Dogs swarmed into the Mexico sector. 5, 6, maybe more. Guards shouting commands, urging them forward, closer to the woodpile. One dog broke away from the pack. Rudolf heard its claws scratching against the boards of their shelter. Short, sharp inhalations. It moved along the base of the woodpile, sniffing, searching. It stopped directly above their heads. Rudolf heard its every movement, sniffing once, twice, a third time, longer this time, more insistent. This is the end, he thought. They waited for the bark that would end their lives, the signal that would bring the guards running, the gunshots that would follow. The dog snorted one more time. Silence. And then the sound of retreating paws, slowly at first, then faster, moving away, joining the pack. The tobacco and gasoline had worked. The chemical fog had blinded the dog's nose completely. They were still alive, still hidden, But that was only the first night. 71 more hours lay ahead. The first night was chaos. The dogs, the sirens, the screams. The second day was silence, and that was worse. 36 hours without movement. Their legs had gone numb the day before. Now sensation began to return, and it was agony. Cramps tore at their calves. Their spines pressed into the boards until the boundary between flesh and wood disappeared. Any movement was noise. Any noise was death. In the darkness, the mind began to devour itself. What if they saw us? What if our friends are being tortured? What if someone talked? Then came the moment that nearly ended everything. Boots, not passing by, stopping, right at the woodpile. Guards, talking, debating. We've checked everything. What about this woodpile? Maybe they're inside. Inside the wood? Impossible. The dogs checked here twice. Dogs make mistakes too. Silence. Rudolph stopped breathing. Alfred's hand gripped his arm. The sound of wood being tossed aside, boards thrown, getting closer to their hiding space. See anything? No, nothing but wood. There's nothing deeper, I told you. The dogs would have found them. The footsteps moved away. They had survived again, but barely, centimeters between discovery and death. Hour 47, hour 50, hour 60. Time lost all meaning. Rudolph couldn't tell if minutes were passing or hours. His body had become a stranger. Muscles that had known no movement for 3 days had forgotten how to work. Hour 72. No barking, no footsteps, no German commands. The outer perimeter had been withdrawn. The hunt was over. Rudolph pressed his palm against the board above his head. It gave way. The first fresh breath in 72 hours. Rudolph wanted to sob. This air smelled of earth, of burning, and of freedom, but it was too early to celebrate. His body wouldn't obey. Muscles had frozen. Clenching his teeth, he pushed himself upward. His shoulders scraped against the boards. He pulled Alfred out. Alfred could barely stand. 2 broken men in borrowed suits, on enemy territory, on legs that could hardly hold them. Night had fallen. The outer perimeter was gone. And then they were out, beyond the fences, beyond the guard towers, beyond the searchlights and the dogs and the electrified wire. For the first time in 2 years, no roll call at dawn, no selections on the platform, no chimneys smoking on the horizon, no smell of burning flesh following them everywhere, no number tattooed on their arms defining them as property of the Reich. Just the cold April night, just the stars above occupied Poland, just the wind carrying the scent of pine trees instead of death, just the sound of their own breathing, free breathing, breathing without fear that the next breath might be their last. Rudolph wanted to collapse, to cry, to scream, but there was no time for any of that, not yet. The border was still 130 kilometers away, and every minute they spent standing still was a minute wasted. But they were still 130 kilometers from the Slovak border, 130 kilometers through enemy territory, without food, without maps, on bodies weakened by 2 years of starvation and slave labor. Could 2 emaciated men in borrowed suits really walk 130 kilometers through Nazi-occupied Poland without being caught? For 11 nights, they moved only in darkness. By day, they hid in forests, in ditches, under fallen trees, anywhere the patrols couldn't find them. Poland was a minefield, German soldiers at every turn, checkpoints on every road, collaborators in every village. They ate whatever they could find, roots, berries, raw grass, nothing for days at a time. Their bodies, already broken by Auschwitz, were breaking down further with every kilometer. Blisters covered their feet, their legs swelled. Every step was agony. On one occasion, they stumbled onto a road and nearly walked into a German patrol. They dove into a ditch and lay still while boots marched past, meters from their heads. On another night, they lost their bearings completely. walked in circles for hours before finding the stars again and reorienting south. But they kept moving, one step at a time, south, toward Slovakia, toward the border, toward a world that didn't know what was happening behind those fences. On April 21st, 14 days after crawling into the Woodpile, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler crossed the Slovak border. They had done the impossible. They had escaped from Auschwitz. But how long would the world take to listen? Would anyone believe what two escaped prisoners had to say about industrialized murder? Rudolf dictated for 3 days straight. He drew maps of the camp. He named names of SS officers. He described the gas chambers in detail that only someone who had seen them could provide. The selection process, the crematoriums, the daily capacity, the methods of deception. 40 pages. The Vrba-Wetzler report, the most important document of the Holocaust. Could 40 pages stop a killing machine that had murdered nearly 2 million people? Could two escaped prisoners convince world leaders to act? His message was urgent. Hungary is next. 800,000 Jews are in danger. The deportations are scheduled for May. 12,000 per day. Warn them now, today, before the trains start rolling. The report was sent to the Jewish Council in Slovakia, from there to Switzerland, to the Vatican, to the Allies. And then came the silence. Weeks of silence, negotiations, bureaucracy, verification requests. The numbers seem exaggerated. We need to verify. It's too complicated. Can this really be true? Rudolf stood by the train station in Žilina in late May when he heard it, a rumble in the distance, getting closer. And then he saw it. The train, freight cars, sealed doors, heading north. He knew this route. He had traveled it himself 2 years ago. He knew where it was going. He knew what waited at the end of the tracks. Tomorrow another train would come, and the day after, and the day after that. He couldn't stop these trains. He couldn't open the doors. He could only stand and watch. The deportation of Hungarian Jews had begun, 12,000 per day, exactly as scheduled. His report sat on desks, unread, unbelieved, unpublished. 437,000 people would board trains in the following weeks. Most would be dead within hours of arriving at Auschwitz. But then something changed. George Mantello, a Jewish businessman working at the El Salvador consulate in Geneva, received a copy of the report in June 1944. He understood immediately what he was holding: evidence of industrialized murder. Mantello organized mass distribution. By June 23rd, 50 copies had been produced, distributed to the Swiss government, to Jewish organizations, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. Students made thousands more copies, passed them to members of parliament, to newspaper editors across Switzerland. The dam finally broke. At least 383 articles about Auschwitz appeared in the Swiss press between June 23rd and July 11th. More coverage in 18 days than all British newspapers had given the Holocaust during the entire war combined. On June 20th, the New York Times published a story about the mass murder at Birkenau. On June 26th, the BBC broadcast details to the world. The word Auschwitz was spoken aloud on international radio for the first time. On June 25th, the Pope sent a public cable to the Hungarian regent. President Roosevelt issued warnings. The King of Sweden appealed directly. World leaders demanded answers, threatened consequences. On July 2nd, American and British forces bombed Budapest, a message that could not be ignored. On July 6th, under mounting international pressure, the Hungarian regent ordered an end to the deportations. On July 9th, 1944, the trains stopped. 200,000 Hungarian Jews were saved. The Jews of Budapest, scheduled for the next transports, survived because the world finally believed what Rudolf Vrba had told them 3 months earlier. But the number haunts every page of this story. By the time the trains stopped, 437,000 Hungarian Jews had already been sent to Auschwitz. 147 trains. almost the entire Jewish population of the Hungarian countryside. 7 weeks. That's how long the report sat on desks while the trains rolled north. 7 weeks of bureaucracy, 7 weeks of disbelief. If someone had listened in April instead of June, how many of those 437,000 could have been saved? Rudolf Vrba spent the rest of his life asking that question. What does a man do with the rest of his life after escaping from Auschwitz? How do you live normally when you've counted nearly 2 million dead? After the war, Rudolf completed a doctorate in chemistry. He became a biochemist. He worked in research laboratories in Czechoslovakia, then England, then Canada. He built a new life from the ashes of the old one. But the past never released its grip. He testified at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. He testified against Holocaust deniers in Toronto in 1985. He wrote a memoir titled, "I Cannot Forgive." The title said everything about what he carried inside him for 60 years. He received the Czechoslovak Medal of Bravery, the Order of Slovak National Insurrection, an honorary doctorate from the University of Haifa. In 2007, Slovakia posthumously awarded him the Order of the White Double Cross. The honors acknowledged his courage. They could not ease his burden. Alfred Wetzler also survived the war. He wrote his own account of the escape, published in Slovak as What Dante Did Not See. He remained in Czechoslovakia. He died on February 8, 1988, in Bratislava. Two men who crawled into a woodpile together, who lay motionless for 72 hours while death hunted them, who walked 130 kilometers on broken legs to deliver a message the world didn't want to hear. Rudolf Vrba died on March 27, 2006, in Vancouver, Canada. He was 81 years old. He saved 200,000 lives with a 40-page report, but until the end of his days, he thought of those he didn't manage to save. This is not just a story about escaping a death camp. This is a warning carved into history. Rudolf Vrba proved that one person can change the world. Two young men with nothing but courage and a pile of wood saved 200,000 people. They found a flaw in a flawless machine. They exploited a 72-hour window. They walked through hell and came out the other side with evidence that stopped the trains. But he also proved something darker, that silence kills, that bureaucracy kills, that the refusal to believe uncomfortable truths kills more efficiently than any weapon ever could. 72 hours in darkness, 130 kilometers on broken legs, 40 pages that should have stopped everything. Rudolf Vrba escaped from Auschwitz, but he spent the rest of his life wondering if anyone ever truly escapes from what they've seen. Two men crawled into a woodpile with nothing but Russian tobacco and hope. 3 days later, they walked out of hell. 14 days later, they crossed a border. 3 months later, they stopped the trains. The line between civilization and darkness is thinner than we want to believe. Rudolf Vrba saw that line. He crossed it, and he spent his life warning us that it still exists. It always will. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.